guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be my December and January wrap-up video. The reason why I'm putting the two of them together is because I only read 4 books in December, and I think I mentioned all of those 4 books in my reading popular Bookstagram favourites video, which I will link up here, and I'll also put it in the description box. So yeah, because I'd already talked about all those books, I figured that there was no point doing a December wrap up, so I'm just gonna whiz through those books really quickly and then get on into the January wrap up. I also had 2 DNFs in December, which I will briefly talk about, and then in January I read 8 books. Which seems to be my happy place. I feel like most of the months I read 8 books. So very quickly I will first talk about the 2 books that I DNF'd. The first one being Under Her Skin, and this is an edited poetry collection which is focusing around horror. All of the people that contributed to this book are either cis, trans, non-binary, but primarily women. I thought this book was a really cool idea because the editors basically wanted a whole bunch of different perspectives about body horror to do with women. So I thought I would really like this book, and I picked it up on NetGalley. I managed to get to about 65% before DNFing. Poetry definitely isn't something that I read very often, if at all. I thought that the horror aspect would be really interesting to me. However, I found that a lot of the poems were kind of repetitive. Maybe there was too many of them, I don't know, but I kind of lost interest. There were only a few of the poems that I highlighted as the ones that I really liked. They were the ones that were primarily about body image. A lot of the poems were talking about very similar things. I didn't feel like there was a lot of diversity across all the poems. And yeah, I just felt like, for me personally, I don't like poetry enough, and I didn't really like this book enough to keep going right until the end. And then my second DNF was So You've Been Publicly Shamed by John Ronson, and this is a non-fiction book. I went into this book expecting it to be about cancel culture and how that maybe isn't the best way to treat people who are a little bit problematic, to just completely remove them from society and shame them. I feel like maybe the author is a comedian or some other kind of personality like that. You can really see his personality in the book, and I feel like it removed me from the non-fiction side of it. A lot of it was about him. I only got to a point where there was about 3 examples of people that had been publicly shamed, but all 3 of them I'd never heard of before, and I'd never heard of this scandal that they were supposedly embroiled in. So I felt like I couldn't really connect to it. I've read other people's reviews, and they're saying that basically the point of this book is to highlight that cancel culture and shaming people publicly is not the best way to deal with things, and I feel like I kind of already know that, so maybe I would read a book similar to this, something that's a bit more maybe up to date, or just told in a bit of a different style that is a bit more appealing to me. I don't feel like this one was for me. Next up, I will talk about some of the books that I read, not for my popular books video, but I read them during that video, if that makes sense. So the first one I read was Good Girl Bad Blood by Holly Jackson, and I've already talked about this a little bit because I mentioned it in my best books of 2021 video. I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. This is the sequel to A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, which I'm sure a lot of you will have already heard of. We follow this girl called Pip who is in high school, and she delves into this cold case for a school project, and everything just kind of takes off from there. And then in the second book, she has basically turned the first book into a podcast, and she's now kind of semi-famous, and she has a lot of people asking her to cover different cases for her podcast if she ever wants to do a new season. Then one of her friend's brothers goes missing in her town, and she decides to do a podcast about that case. So I thought this book was so good. I gave the first book maybe 4.5 out of 5. I thought it was really, really good, especially for a YA mystery thriller. However, I thought the second book was even better because it just got a little bit darker. Pip is one of my all-time favourite characters, and I loved seeing how she changed from the first book when she was very naive and innocent, and now she's starting to realise that the justice system isn't everything that she'd ever hoped for. And then the end of this book took a really dark turn. I really didn't expect the ending, but I loved it. Overall, I just thought it was such a good middle book, especially for a trilogy, which this series is. I feel like a lot of the time the second book doesn't really take you anywhere, but I felt like this one was a really, really good example of a second book. And yeah, I just loved it. I thought it was really, really good. The next book that I read during that video was Parent Apart by Gary Wright. Another 5-star, so I had a really good reading month in December. This book is a debut novel written by an author who used to be a police officer in the UK. So in this book we're following this guy, I can't remember his name, but he has a young daughter, and him and his wife have this best friend couple who have a child who is the same age as their daughter, so they got on really well. One day the main character is looking after his daughter and her friend, and he takes them to the beach. However, there's this massive storm going on, and the children end up getting swept out into the water, and the dad basically has to make this really horrible decision where he feels like he can't save both of these children. And then the rest of the book just follows the consequences of this decision for not only both children's parents, but also the police and just the people in the community in general. And I thought this book was so good. It was really fast paced. It had a lot of talk about police investigations, and I love all that kind of thing. So it was really interesting to see all that, especially knowing that the author himself was a police officer. So I feel like it felt very, realistic. There were some really shocking moments in this book where it went places that I didn't expect it to go. I loved following from the different point of views, and I thought the end of this book was perfect. It was so good. Really unexpected, but totally perfect. And I think this will be so good as a TV show. I can just totally picture it as like a BBC ITV drama. And yeah, I would highly recommend this book, especially with it being like such a new debut author. Next up, I'm going to very quickly talk about the 2 books that I read for the Bookstagram video. So the first 2, which I finished in December, were It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover and The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I'll start with this one because I liked this one better. I gave this book a 4.5 out of 5. I don't want to spoil anything about this book in case you really don't want to know. It definitely doesn't follow the same story as a traditional romance would. The thing I like the most about this book is that it made me cry. If you've seen my videos before, you all know that I love a book that makes me cry, and I did cry at 2 points in this book. One of them being like within the story, but then I actually cried at the afterward as well, where Colleen Hoover talks about why she decided to write this book, and I just thought it was so beautiful. The only reason I didn't give this book a 5-star was because with it being a romance, it does have a lot of like cheesy, corny, rom-com type situations in there, which I feel like just aren't for me. I feel like this book really helps you delve into the mindset of someone who's in this situation. For example, there was a bit where it talked about how the people that hurt you the most are the same people who can often make you feel better because you love them, and they're the ones that you want to cheer you up. And I feel like that's just really stuck with me and has made me better understand why people end up in these situations and how they end up getting trapped in these situations. And yeah, I feel like it definitely deserves all the hype that it's currently got. And then with Evelyn Hugo, I'm also going to whiz through this because I already talked about this in my most disappointing books of the year. Basically, I gave this a 3.5 out of 5, I think. Everyone knows the story of this book. We're basically following this woman called Evelyn Hugo. She is a glamorous Hollywood star who is now telling her story as she's like an older woman. The story of her 7 husbands, the great love of her life, all that jazz. I did enjoy this book. I liked the story. I thought it felt very gossipy, celebrity. I loved all that. However, I didn't feel like I was invested in any of the characters really. It just isn't going to stay with me, unfortunately. I felt like I was disappointed in it because everyone says this is like their favourite book of all time, and I'm like, I don't really see it. It's well written and everything. I felt like I should connect more to the characters than I didn't. So yeah, this one ended up being like an okay read for me. And then the last book that I read for that video, which I finished in January, is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. This book I gave a 4 out of 5. We're following this woman called Nora who at the very start of the book is very depressed and she ends up deciding that she wants to take her own life. Then she ends up in this kind of purgatory state where she's in the Midnight Library and she can see a book of all the regrets that she's ever had, and then all the rest of the books in the library are alternate lives that she can just step into that are based on the regrets that she has at the minute. So if she's ever had a regret, there will be a life where that regret never happened, and she can just step into it and carry on life from there. So we're following Nora as she tries out all these different lives. It's a really fast-paced book. It's very interesting. I loved seeing all of the different lives that Nora steps into and seeing how all of the side characters play a part in all of her different lives. I also liked how it got very kind of deep at the end and it ended up feeling really motivational and inspiring. I thought this would be a really emotional read, but it actually ended up being quite heartwarming. Although as I'm telling you this now, I can't really remember exactly what about this book I found motivational. Like, I feel like there were some quotes that were pretty good, but I didn't highlight them or anything, and I should probably go back to this at some point and just, find the bits that I actually really liked. So yeah, I thought this was a really fast little read. I think it's less than 300 pages, and I feel like it was really, really good. The next book that I read in January was called The Best of Friends by Lucinda Berry. This book basically follows these 3 women who were all best friends, and they each have sons who were all the same age, and the 3 sons that they have are all best friends as well. So one day these 3 sons who were all best friends are hanging out and something happens. We don't really know what happens, but one of them is killed by a gunshot wound, one of them is in a coma, and one of them is too traumatized to speak. So we're kind of following the mystery of what happened there, but we're also following the effects of this night on the parents, so on the mums in this book. I did enjoy my time reading this book, but I also found it a little bit forgettable. I found it really hard to distinguish between the three characters, so we're following the three points of view of the mums, and I honestly got them confused so many times. I also thought it delved into plot points that weren't really resolved. So for example, there's this incident that the three women talk about that happened in high school and they don't really talk about anymore, and we just never really found out what that is. I thought that the big reveal at the end was a little bit underwhelming. It kind of came out randomly out of nowhere because the book was coming to an end, and I feel like the rest of the book felt more like a contemporary fiction story. I wouldn't like tell you to go out and read this immediately, but it definitely wasn't something that I would say don't read. Like, it was okay, it was fine. The next 4 books I'm going to talk about, I also talk about in my Winterween vlog. So I'm sorry that this wrap up is probably a bit repetitive to those of you who watch my videos regularly, but I am going to briefly summarise what I thought here. The first book that I read for this vlog was Stolen Tongs by Felix Blackwell, and this book started off really promisingly. I thought it was probably the scariest book that I've ever read. The first third was just amazing. I read this book entirely in the dark. I was scared to go to the toilet. I had to put the lights on, like it was that kind of scary. This book is kind of hard to explain because it follows like a couple of different trips with this couple where they go and stay in like different locations. Something creepy is happening. They feel like they can hear voices outside. Our main character's girlfriend is able to speak back to the voices outside. So the whole thing about the fiance in this book was really scary. However, I feel like this book was a little bit too long. I feel like it would have worked better as a novella because I feel like the longer that this book went on, the less scary it got for me. I felt like the horror was a bit repetitive because it would be the same things happening over and over again. And I felt like once the explanation of what was happening came, it didn't feel as scary anymore. I do feel like with horror, at least in my experience, there's such a fine line between telling the reader too much about what's happening and not telling them enough, and just getting that right balance. And with this one, I feel like it went a bit too far into the explanation about what was happening. I didn't really connect with any of the side characters who were meant to be really important, and I wasn't as scared towards the end as I was in the first third, which I thought was so good. Like, the first third of this book was like 5 out of 5, and then the end was kind of like, I don't know, 2, 3, so I rounded it all to a 3. And then the next book that I read for Winterween is probably my favourite book that I've read this year. I know it's only February, but I feel like it's going to be my favourite book for a long time. And that was We Need to Do Something by Max Booth III. This book blew me away. This is exactly the horror that I love. It's a really short novella. I read it all in one sitting in the dark. It's basically about this family who already have a very tense and strained relationship with each other, and during this tornado warning, because they don't have a basement, which I think is where you would normally go during a tornado warning, I don't know, I mean, we don't get those in England, all the family go into this really tiny little bathroom, and as a result of this tornado they end up being stuck there. Honestly, this book was just so good. The second that the tone changes from this family being stuck inside, oh my god, I was so scared. I feel like if you've read this book then you know which point I'm talking about, but something happens and I don't think I'll ever be the same person again from reading that. I was telling my boyfriend about this book and he was like, stop it, like, you're freaking me out, stop. This is probably one of the most disturbing books I've ever read, mainly because of that scene that I've just mentioned, but also because of how harrowing it is to see people in a situation like this. Just seeing how you would deal with this situation, seeing how everyone's getting more desperate. I felt like I never knew what was coming. I didn't know what to expect. As a result of that, so much of this book was really shocking to me, really horrifying. I absolutely loved the suspense and all the scenes where it was like, what could be going on out there? What could be happening? Are they going to get rescued? I feel like that's exactly what I mean when I was talking about the balance of the right amount of horror, like telling the reader enough or not telling them enough. And I feel like this book was just the perfect example of telling you enough to make you absolutely terrified, but keeping it also very open to the imagination as well. I literally couldn't put it down because I read it all in one sitting. I loved everything about it. I loved the characters. I loved the explanations that we did get. I loved the horror. It was so gory. It was so disturbing. It was honestly perfect. And if you know any other books that are similar in vibe or tone to this, then let me know because I'm desperate and I feel like everyone should read this if you're into horror. This is exactly my like nightmare situation So if you want to know more about my fears, then this is it. Obviously this book was a 5 out of 5. The next book that I read for Winterween was also a 5 out of 5 star, and that was No Exit by Taylor Adams. So we're basically following this girl called Darby. I think she's at university and she's driving home to see her mum. She ends up getting stuck in a snowstorm and she stops at this rest stop. However, when she's there, they're all kind of trapped there, and she thinks that she sees a child in the back of someone's van, like a child in a cage locked in this van, and she realises that the only person that could have this child there is in this rest stop with her, so she's kind of trapped with a kidnapper. It is so fast paced, so action packed, and it would make the best film. The twist in this book, really shocking. There was literally never a boring moment. I thought that Darby herself was like one of the most badass female characters I've ever read. She was really brave, she was really on it the whole time, and I loved her little like sassy comebacks and stuff. It gave me like the perfect level of frustration with what was happening, and the amount of stress and tension was just so high. And then the final twist in this book was perfectly done. I had to reread it and be like, what? Holy shit. So if you really like your mystery thrillers to be like smack you in the face, fast paced, constant action, then this one is definitely for you. The final book that I read for Winterween, I've only ever seen really good reviews for this book, but I didn't really like it. And it was Near the Bone by Christina Henry. I gave it a 2.5 out of 5, which is like straight down the middle. In this book, we're following this girl who lives with her husband in a really secluded little cabin on a mountain, and there's nobody else there. However, one day she comes across the body of, I think it's an animal, which has clearly been killed by something a lot bigger than the other animals that live on this mountain. So there's this fear that they're not alone, something's coming to get them. But then we also have this extra element of horror where the couple are not what they seem, and the girl is actually facing a lot of domestic abuse, and it's really, really awful to read. So she's kind of got this horrible home life, but then there's also this threat from the outside as well. I listened to this book on audio mainly, and I don't know if that was the issue with this book, because the audiobook narrator was so annoying. There's a few different voices that our main character has. There's like her normal voice, there's her voice from kind of when she's a child that comes out a lot, and then there's like a tough inner character as well. So throughout the book she's kind of flicking between these 3 different personas, I suppose, and each persona had a different voice. So a lot of the book will be told in this really like high-pitched, squeaky babyish voice, and I just could not deal with it. I found the main character pretty annoying, and I feel bad saying that because the situation that she's in is awful, but I found her to be really annoying. Like, she was almost a bit too submissive for me to read about and actually like her. And like I said, I do feel bad saying that because I understand why she's that timid and submissive, but it was getting on my nerves. Like, I feel like in this situation, I just wanted her to snap out of it. I wanted to give her a shake so many times. I was like, you're in some serious danger. There is an opportunity for you to get out of this situation, and you're just not taking it. And it was just driving me a bit mad. I also felt that this book was pretty slow and it dragged a lot. There was a lot of repetition. So for example, there was a lot of just sentences that said that if our main character did something, then William wouldn't like that. Or the things that he would do if he found out that she'd done this. And I was like, I get it. I get it. You've said this to me so many times. Just because you're telling me more and more doesn't mean that I believe it more and more. Like, we already know that this guy's a piece of shit. You don't need to like bash me over the head with it every time that she tries to do something to like get out of this situation. It was just driving me insane. And because this book was mainly about the domestic side rather than the actual horror outside, the monster which is introduced in this book I couldn't give 2 shits about. I didn't find them scary. I didn't understand their purpose. I didn't understand their motive, especially going from the 3 books that I just read where all of the horror or the villains in these books were truly terrifying and scary. I didn't really believe in these ones. I didn't believe in this monster being scary, and I felt like William was just a bit of like a caricature of a scary person. I felt like she was pretty safe from this monster. Like, even though she wasn't, I felt like this monster kind of left her alone a lot of the time. So I'm like, okay. Almost seemed a bit convenient because she could kind of forget about the monster and then deal with her husband. It needed to just focus on one or the other because I don't think it dealt with both of them well together. And I also thought that the ending wrapped up a little bit too quickly, and that the characters in this book made some really dumb decisions that really annoyed me. There was one bit where they're like packing a bag to go down the mountain, and they decide to not take a lot of food because it'll be heavy. Like, I know you don't take all the food, but take some food for God's sake. Is there nothing that's like light but will keep you full? Like, half the time they're like starving hungry and they just think, oh, the food will be too heavy. Like, no, like, you need food. And they also forget their weapons. They forget their weapons. They've got these 2 horrible monsters coming after them, and they just forget to bring any weapons with them. And I just think, like, that's so dumb. Would you really forget? Surely that's the first thing on your mind. Like, provisions and weapons, like the two basic things, and they like get them completely wrong. Probably would not recommend this book. We've only got 2 more to go, and I'm going to be really quick because I actually need to leave very soon. So the next book that I read was the 3rd book in the Good Girls Guide to Murder series, which is called As Good as Dead by Holly Jackson. This one has very mixed reviews. The first 2 books are generally quite well liked. The reviews I saw for this one were like, we either loved it or we either thought it was so disappointing. I kind of settled in the middle, and I ended up giving this one a 3.5 out of 5, which is my lowest rating for the series, but I still enjoyed the book. This one, I can't really talk about what happens without spoiling the rest of the series, but this one completely flips everything on its head and just takes on like a completely different tone to the rest of the books, which I think is why people probably don't like it. But I thought it kind of made sense, but I'm not entirely sure I would have wanted that for her story. I don't know. Nevertheless, I enjoyed it. I liked how it threaded a lot of the storylines from like the first book and the second book, and it all kind of came full circle and it all connected together really well. There was something about this book that just felt a little bit off to me because Pip as a character seems to have changed so much from the first book, and it makes sense due to what's happened throughout the series, but I wasn't sure if I loved reading all about that. It was almost like her rational, calculating side was still there, and I loved her like methodical way of thinking. However, her morals and her perspective on justice was a little bit skewed and a bit off, and I didn't really like how she did whatever she wanted, but I do think that the ending kind of addressed that. So I did like how Holly Jackson dealt with all of the story, but I'm just not sure I love how the story ended for Pip, who is like one of my favourite all-time characters. I'll leave it at that because I obviously don't want to go into spoilers, but I would be really interested to know what you guys thought if you've read this series. I'm still glad I read it, and I really love the trilogy as a whole, and I would definitely recommend it if you like YA mystery thrillers. It's definitely one of the best that I've ever read. And then the last book that I read in January was Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. This book I've had on my list for so long. I bought it ages ago when I read Normal People, which is probably about 2 years ago now. I gave Normal People a 5-star. I gave this one a 4-star. This book is following these 2 best friends, Frances and Bobby. They meet this other couple who are older than them called Melissa and Nick, who are married. This book kind of follows their messy relationship with each other. It feels very much like a coming of age contemporary fiction story. I really like the way that Sally Rooney writes. I feel like she doesn't waffle and everything is very concise, simple, but also very like profound at the same time. I really liked Frances as a character. I loved how real she felt. She was like really selfish at times, really destructive, and I just loved that. I loved reading the conversations that she was having with Nick over email and like over text. I loved the bit where they go on this summer trip. Oh my god, the vibes were immaculate. It reminded me of the trip that they go on in Normal People, where they go and stay at that villa. It felt very much like that. This is like the first book. I don't know where it is at the minute. I'm not sure where I've put it. But this is one of the first books that I've ever read that I've actually tabbed. There were a few things that I tabbed, just some quotes I thought were really good, and I also cried a little bit as well at one part, so I tabbed that as well. However, my only thing with this book that made it a 4-star was that although some of the conversations and some of the things that Sally Rooney has to say feel very intelligent and smart, and a lot of it is very like quotable, but some of it I did feel bordered on like pretentious a bit, or like felt a little bit forced. For example, we'll be following a couple of the characters, they'll be at like a dinner party or something, and it will talk about like all the intelligent debate that they're having, and I feel like I wanted to see more about the relationship dynamics, but it was talking about like the profound things that one of them said. There was one quote, I can't remember exactly now, but it was saying how untouched nature is intrinsically patriarchal, has been like fetishized, but it's patriarchal, and I just didn't get what that meant. Like, it didn't explain it enough. How is nature patriarchal? I don't understand. So I felt like some of it was just kind of like thrown in there to make some of the characters look really intelligent, but it wasn't explained enough, or the character didn't explain themselves enough for me to understand what they meant. They just came across as a bit like pretentious, which I think Bobby is meant to be, but she was also meant to be like really clever and really charming, and I wanted to see that side of her more. But other than that, I really liked this book. I really rooted for Frances. I really liked the ending, even though I'm not sure if I'm meant to like the ending. A lot of the characters are unlikable or have unlikable traits, but I also really liked all of them because of all of the unlikable things about them. They just felt very real. Now I really want to read the other one that she's brought out. I can't remember what it's called. It's like Beautiful World something or other. Let me know which your favourite Sally Rooney book is if you've read from her. Mine is definitely Normal People still. That book has my heart. So yeah, that is all the books I have to talk to you about today. all the books that I read in December and January. Let me know down in the comments what you've been reading this month, if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. If you like this video, give it a like. If you want to subscribe, that would mean the world to me, and I will hopefully see you in my next video. Bye!